Good morning, Shabbat Shalom, and welcome once again. I'm Rabbi Ed Feinstein. This is my dear friend, Rabbi Marc Gellman, joining me this morning for VBS Torah Study. Mark, good morning. How you doing?
Good. Shabbat Shalom, Chag
Shabbat.
Sameach.
Thank you. Shabbat Shalom, Hag Sameach. We're giving our friend Sherry Hirsch, Rabbi Sherry Hirsch, a break this morning and letting her have a little bit of special holiday and Shabbos time with her family. This morning, of course, is Shabbat, and it's Shemini Atzeret, the 8th day of assembly, the 8th day of the that follows the holiday of Sukkot. I'm sitting here in my virtual sukkah, but in fact,
Lovely sukkah it is. Let me just
well,
say,
thank you so much.
very lovely. Schak. I love your schak. The
You like
greatest
my
Hebrew word ever made. Schak. It's like you can't say it without spitting on someone.
You can't say it without getting caught in your throat. That's wonderful. And then, of course, tonight we will celebrate Simchat Torah. We'll finish the reading of the Torah, roll it back to the beginning, and then Sunday morning we'll continue this with Hakafot, with marching around the synagogue, and we will read from the beginning of Breshit and begin our whole Torah cycle all over again. The beautiful thing about these holidays, of course, is that they're complete opposite to what we experienced on Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur is a day of fasting. These are days of feasting. Yom Kippur is all inside, in the synagogue. Here we go outside and live in the sukkah. Yom Kippur is a day of denial. These are days of indulging and enjoying. And most of all, of course, Yom Kippur, the Torah is very heavy. Faith, religion demands a tremendous amount of us in terms of reflection and self-improvement, self-monitoring. And on Simchat Torah, the Torah is something we dance with. It becomes an object, a symbol of our joy, a symbol of our celebration of the joy of Jewish life. Well, we want to begin with an interesting fact of the Torah reading. So the Torah reading that goes this morning begins in Deuteronomy, and the section that, of course, the Torah is interested in is a recitation of the holiday schedule of Deuteronomy. Because there are not enough verses in that section, the rabbis of the tradition backed it up. They backed up the beginning of the Torah reading to go all the way back to Deuteronomy chapter 14, verse 22. And what they picked up is they picked up a set of verses, and we'll see this in just a moment, a set of verses that deal with, of all things, money. And I don't think this was an accident, because I think that what they were trying to say to us is that we are leaving our holiday season now. We are leaving behind Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Sukkot, and now Shemini Atzeret and Simchas Torah, and we're going to begin normal days. We'll have a week next week without any holidays until Shabbat. You know, the next big Jewish holiday is Halloween and Thanksgiving before we get to Hanukkah. But right now, we're going back to the normal life of the marketplace. Up until now, at least for the last month or so, because of the holidays, the marketplace has been turned upside down. This year, by the way, it wasn't so bad for us because the holidays were on Saturdays and Sundays. But next year, the holidays will be Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. So we'll have another one of those years in which the Jewish holidays just wreak havoc on everybody's working schedule if you observe them. Well, the question then is, as we're going back to the marketplace, as we're going back to the practice of making a living, accumulating money, using our money, what are the sacred implications of that? What are the sacred implications of economics? And I want to just point out one sort of interesting, quirky fact. The Bible is completely unabashed about this. The Bible's not embarrassed at all to tell you how to use your money. But we have a different sense. I think it's a sense, and Mark, you can help me understand this. I think it's a sense that we inherited, not from our own tradition, but from the Christian tradition. Because the same Christian tradition that saw spirituality and materiality as opposed to each other, the soul and the body, as it were, at war with each other. Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and render unto God what is God's. That same Christian tradition, or Christian way of looking at the world, found its way into Judaism. And a lot of us feel that there's something untoward about talking about money. Now, in polite conversation, this is certainly true. I mean, polite conversation, people can talk about, you know, their sex lives and their health issues and their children. But if you raise their, you know, their money, their net worth, it's like pasnisht. It's not allowed. It's not polite. And certainly in the synagogue, this is true. One of the things that we rabbis do frequently, and we had to do it this year again, nothing we want to do, but any nonprofit, any institution that makes a difference in the world and doesn't sell services has to appeal to people for donations. And we had to appeal for people for donations. This year in particular, because we have so many families who are in trouble, we had to ask folks people who have weathered these storms rather well, if they could help us provide scholarship help for families with kids, find scholarship help to keep programs going, find assistance so that we can keep staff working until things get a little bit better. And there is a certain element in the community that finds this not only finds this unpleasant, I don't think anybody likes this, but a certain community of people who find this actually offensive. And I get a letter every year, I'm sure that every rabbi in America does, from somebody who tells me that they were deeply offended that I interrupted the sanctity of the holiday. I interrupted the sanctity of their prayers and their introspection to raise something as filthy or as contaminated, as polluted, as an issue of money. And it's an interesting letter to read. Because again, I mean, I'm not doing this for myself. I'm doing this because I want to be able to continue to maintain a community. I want to maintain the state of Israel. I want to maintain the services of the community to those who have a lot less than we do. And yet, people find this offensive. Well, if you look in the Torah, it's a very different attitude. The Torah has a very strong sense that holiness has to carry over into normal days. I mean, Shabbos is a holy day, but it has to be on Monday that we go back to the workplace and have to carry these ethics. There's a very lovely story about the first Abraham Joshua Heschel. That was our Rabbi Heschel's great-grandfather. The Abda Rav was once told about a certain Jew that he was very, very Shomer Shabbos, very, very observant of the Sabbath. And the Abda Rav, Rav Heschel, said, yeah, but is he Shomer Chol? Which means, does he carry his ethics into the normal conduct of his life on the weekday, in the marketplace, in the world of money and economics? So Mark, let's begin with this question. What does Torah have to say to the Jew who is making a living in the world and wants to know, what does my tradition guide me? How does my tradition guide me in my conduct as an economic person, my conduct with money, the way that I use my money, what's obligated, what I'm obligated for in using my money? What does Torah say about using wealth?
Right. It's probably the most distinctive contribution of Judaism to the world of ethics. And it's the most distinctive belief of Judaism, in my opinion, distinguishing our faith from those of other Western traditions and the East. And that is this idea that you and I, we own nothing. We own nothing. Kol haaretz li, the whole earth is mine, says the Lord. Everything is God's, which means that our teaching is that God owns everything and everything we have is a gift. Even if we earned it and worked hard for it, it's a gift. And that makes it a very different relationship. Your relationship to your wealth, if you think you actually own your stuff, is different than if you think, well, it's all God's, and God tells me how much of it I can use for myself and how much I have to give away. That's consistent with the distinction we've talked about before, that in Judaism, there is no sense of personal rights. It's a religion built on the notion of duty, of obligation. And that obligation comes from a commanding God who creates a set of behaviors that we follow. And in following those behaviors, we fulfill God's will in the world. And so that, for that reason, we're told, well, you think you own what you have. And if, let's say, you're a farmer, you own your crops because you paid for the seed and you worked hard to raise the crops. Well, that's wrong. 10% of what you own altogether, whether you're a farmer or not, has to be given away. And the best way to identify this distinction between Judaism and all the other faiths of the world in relation to money is the difference between the words tzedakah and charity. Charity comes from caritas, which means caring, compassion, kindness. Tzedakah comes from the Hebrew word tzedek, which means justice. So the reason you got the angry letter is that that was a person who believed that when they give money to the shul or anything, that it is what we call in philosophy a supererogatory act, which means an act above and beyond the call of duty, that we do something that we aren't required to do, but we do it because we're a good person and we want to do a nice thing. And that's what charity is. It's giving when you don't have to give, you own everything you think you own, and you're giving it away as an act of kindness. That is absolutely not the Jewish view. And part of it is shown in the rabbinic teaching that when someone gives a gift of tzedakah, you're not allowed to say thank you. You're not allowed to say thank you. You have to say to that person, mazel tov, meaning congratulations that you lived a life where you have the wherewithal to support a synagogue and support a community. So charity, if you don't give it, you're still fine because you didn't have to give it. Tzedakah, you have to give. You have no choice because it's your duty to give. And so I think that distinction is very, very powerful. I think the Christians, I think the distinction you make between Christian notions of gashmiut, of physicality and earthiness and our income is true, but only up to a point. There is a very strong Christian charitable impulse, and it's continuing to this day. It continues to this day, and I would say that the idea that we were once the most charitable people in the world, I think that idea is under siege. And I think as the fabric of Jewish life weakens, one of the ways you can see it is the willingness of the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren of Jews who came to America and were unbelievably charitable. They had no money and they gave away a lot of what they had. Their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren are a little bit more stingy, maybe a lot more stingy. And the letter you got is a reflection of it. So my view is that Judaism has a profound idea about money. It's the result of our notion of duty, that God owns the world and we only are caretakers. And it's imperiled now because we live in a world in which people think everything they give is charity.
Thank you. I think that's right. I believe, I agree with you, but I want to go farther. I think that the Torah has more in mind than just that. Yeah, I find when I read the Torah that there's a tremendous anxiety in Torah. And it occurs, I think, principally around Levitical issues in the book of Leviticus and also in this section of Deuteronomy, which is very Levitical because it's about tithing and about the temple. The Levites had no money. The Levites were wards of the community, basically. So the Levites were in a very interesting position to observe the way people use their wealth. And I think that they were deeply affected by the prospect of systemic poverty. They're worried about it. More than worried about it, they were allergic to it. And so they institute a set of issues, a set of laws, a set of obligations, which try to bring us back to a sense of basic income and income equality. And you can see there's a certain deep impracticality to these rules, excuse me, because you can't run an economy this way, right? I mean, there's a deep impracticality to this, but you can hear what their deep anxiety is. Let's take a look inside at the text, okay? Here's the text. So this is the section we're reading today, okay? Deuteronomy 14:22. You shall set aside every year a tenth part of all the yield of your sowing that is brought from your field. You shall consume the tithe of your new grain and wine and oil, and the firstlings of your herd and flocks in the presence of the Lord your God, in the place where he'll choose to establish his name, so that you may learn to revere the Lord your God. So you take a tenth of what you got, you bring it to the temple. Should the distance be too great, and you're unable to transport all this stuff, well, you can convert it into money, right? Wrap up the money. It's an interesting idea. Like your mother always said, be careful with your wallet, right? And then spend the money on anything you want, but you got to do it in the presence of God. You and rejoice with your household. And then here's the coda: do not neglect the Levite in your community, for he has no hereditary portion. Okay? So what you need to do is you have to use this to celebrate the holiday, and the Levite is included in the holiday. Every third year you bring a full tithe, but you'll bring out a full tithe, but leave it within your settlements. Then the Levite who has no hereditary portion, the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow in your settlements can come and eat their fill. So every third year, you take a tenth and you give it to the poor of the community. You don't bring it to the temple. You spend it where you are, but you're gonna give it away to those in the community who need it. Now we're gonna get even more radical. So buckle your seatbelts. And I'm going to remind you that this is Torah, okay? Every seventh year, you practice remission of debts. Now, just think of that for a minute, right? You buy a car, you owe money on the car, year 7 comes, it's done. You don't owe the money anymore. This shall be the nature of remission. Every creditor shall remit the due he claims from his fellow. He shall not dun his fellow or a kinsman, for remission proclaimed by the Lord. You may dun a foreigner, but you must remit what is due from your kinsman. So outsiders are not covered by this. This is an internal thing. So the question you're going to ask right away is, now, wait a minute. If it's true that I am to remit debts, first of all, who's going to lend money? I mean, you'll have a mortgage, and you'll only write the mortgage for 6 years because you know you're going to lose it in the 7th year. And what does that do to an economy? But you can see what they were worried about. What they were worried about was the accumulation of debt. Was the farmer who has a bad harvest and has to go borrow. And then he has another bad harvest and he has to go borrow more. And pretty soon he is in hock to the bank, or he is in hock to his creditor, who then fundamentally makes him a servant, makes him a tenant farmer on the land, because he's spending all of his accumulated wealth just paying back what was owed, and the interest mounts up. And the Torah is so worried about the burden of debt that it basically eliminates the whole notion of debt. Now, what happened, of course, is that the rabbis came up with a solution to this. Solution is called the prose bull. It was a takana of Rabbi Hillel, who basically said, look, so what you do is this is obligatory on every individual, but it's not obligatory on the institutions of the community. So you take the debt in the 7th year, sign it over to the community holds it through the 7th year and gives it back to you in the 8th. It's a way of getting around it. But it's not a way of getting around the problem that it's trying to solve, and that's what Rabbi Gellman was talking about. How do you prevent systemic poverty from finding its way into an economy? How do you prevent the radical nature of income inequality? There's one more point about the Torah I want to point out, then we'll get Rabbi Gellman's further comments. So here the Torah steps up and says, well, wait a minute. You don't have to worry. You're a godly people. There shall be no needy among you. Well, that's a nice idea. And that's a prediction, by the way, not a commandment. It's a prediction. Why? Because God's going to bless you, right? God's going to bless your land. You'll never have any trouble. As long as you keep Torah, God will never bless you. But look at the very next paragraph. If, however, there's a needy person among you. So the dialogue here within the text is remarkable. So one guy says, well, but the theology should be that there should be no needy people if God's taking care of us. And the answer is, yeah, sure. And the beautiful way is it says, if there is a needy person, me'achicha, he is achicha, he is your brother. He belongs to you. right? Open your hand and lend to him sufficient what he needs. Beware of saying the seventh year is approaching, I'm not going to lend him money. Beware of that. So what you have here is a recognition that this is very impractical. This is very impractical. But there's a reaching toward an ideal here. It's an ideal of creating a society where economics will not crush human souls. And that, I think, is a very, very beautiful picture of a people struggling to try to do the right thing. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that you're exactly right. And I think that ethically speaking and historically speaking, there is no way to reconcile income equality and the marketplace. In the marketplace, we sell our labor and we sell our goods for whatever someone will buy them for. And if we don't have skills or we don't have valuable things to sell, it means that we become poor. And the prophets knew there will always be poor among you, and it's something that the marketplace produces. Now, the only way to alter that is to alter the marketplace. The problem with altering the marketplace is that it hurts the very people that you want to help. So this is a classic example of how a good idea has a bad consequence. You want to help the poor, so you institute the remission of debts in the Shemitah year. But on the other hand, forget about a 7-year loan. If you're in the 6th year, you're getting a 1-year loan. You have to pay it all back in a year. So here, it's fine if you're rich, but if you're rich, you don't need to borrow money. So if you're poor, the idea of releasing you from debt only means that you will be cut off from credit. And if you're cut off from credit, you're a farmer, you can't borrow money to pay for seed, to plant seeds. If you can't plant seeds, you can't get a crop. You can't get a crop, you can't live. So the marketplace prevents you from doing what your impulses want you to do. Now, the solution of the Torah is to modify the marketplace slightly. For example, the like a ketzircha, the gleaning of the fields. All right, so it says you're a farmer, you harvest your stuff, but you can't cut down the corners of the field to pass. So because that's for the poor, they come and they get free grain in the corners of your field. You can't harvest all your grapes. That's for the poor. They get to pick what was fallen. And one of the things that I was most proud of in the 40 years that I was serving the congregation, nearly 40 years, was that we instituted there the Temple Beth Torah gleaning. And what we did is we found a farm. A farmer was very wonderful. It was a U-Picket farm, because on Long Island, you had a lot of those that hadn't sold out to developers. Now they've all sold out. But basically, at the time, there were some U-Picket farms. And I said, can we bring people, and the local food bank that Tom Hartman and I were members of the board, and can we bring the food bank and we'll bring volunteers and pick what's in your fields at the end of your harvest. And we did that for 20 years. And hundreds of thousands of pounds of vegetables that we would pull out of these fields, green beans and eggplants and other things that they were planting that they weren't going to harvest. They were just going to plow back under. And the food banks needed the food because they could get some donations of canned goods and other things. The thing that they needed most that they couldn't get were fresh vegetables for their soup kitchens. And that's what we provided in our gleaning. And families would come out together and they would all pick, and they were smiling and happy. And it was the single most joyous and prideful moment of my rabbinate in the synagogue. that we were able to take this old biblical law and say, you know what? We're in a marketplace economy now, but we can still bring back some of these supposedly archaic and supposedly irrelevant and impossible commandments. And we can participate in it that way. I'll never forget a little girl came and handed me an eggplant. Maybe she was 7 or 8 years old. She said, "Here, Rabbi, this is for people who are hungry." And my mommy says, "This is where we get the eggplant parmesan that she makes." And here's the eggplant. And now I'm going to go look for the field with these tomato sauce. And we're going to bring that back for the poor people too, so that they can have eggplant parmesan. And so it's possible to do some of these things. It is impossible to distort the economy for supposedly ethical purposes. We know that when, for example, price controls are put on in an economy, that they say, gas is too expensive. It hurts poor people who don't have the money for gasoline. We're going to make gasoline 15 cents a gallon or whatever we decide in our committees in the Congress. And whatever it is, that's the price. Well, that's fine. You tell the marketplace gasoline is now, $1 a gallon or less. And so no one sells gasoline to the gas stations because they can't make money at that price. And so you come with your car and you need gasoline, and yeah, it's a cheap price, but there's no gasoline. So this is the way that the marketplace inevitably crushes any attempt to alter it, even with the best of intentions.
Well, I just want to, I don't know if I want to disagree with you, but I want to modify this, because Leket and Peah are really, they're not structural modifications to the marketplace like price controls, but they're using basically taxation and the coercive power of government to remove a certain degree of wealth from certain people and redistributing it to other people, right?
Yes.
Let's take a look at the classic Jewish source for this, okay? This is Deuteronomy 24, right? You'll not subvert the rights of the stranger, the fatherless, or the widow. Don't take a widow's garment and pawn. We'll come back to that one. Remember, you were a slave. When you reap the harvest of your field and overlook a sheaf, do not turn back to get it. It goes to the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow, in order that God may bless you. When you beat down the fruit of the olive trees, or you gather the groups of the vineyard, do not pick it over. It goes to the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow. Always remember you were a slave in the land of Egypt. Well, that's not a structural modification of the marketplace. The marketplace still works, except it tells you that you, Farmer Mark, you are entitled to the first pass through the field, the first harvest pass through the vineyard, the first harvest of the orchard. Thereafter, you can't go back. In fact, and remember, this isn't charity, this is property law, because from after that moment, it doesn't belong to you anymore, because it never really belonged to you. It belonged to God. You have rights to the first pass through the field, but thereafter, the poor of the community can come and take for themselves. It's not theirs. And then, of course, the Talmud adds the famous thing that you have to leave the land. You have to get completely off the premises so that they're not intimidated and not humiliated, and that you don't build a culture of dependency in the sense that nobody feels they owe you for having given them access to the rest of the stuff you didn't manage to harvest through pass number one. That's not a structural change in the marketplace, but it's certainly a very powerful law that alters the flow of wealth in an economy.
Yes, I agree. That's really what I was trying to say, that kind of modification the Torah was able to do. However, even that doesn't work. It only works when basically you're all farmers. But what happens when basically all of you are not farmers? And there's no field, there's no corners of a CPA office where they have money that they can't collect. When you're all of a sudden in a money economy, It's a different thing. And that is the difference between the ancient world and the modern world, even the medieval world. And that is that they didn't understand the value of money. They understood the value of crops, and they could alter, who can harvest them. But once crops are turned into money, and then money is lent, the Torah, this is one of its most clear blind spots. It doesn't understand the ethical nature of interest. That money is like an eggplant. Money is like anything. It has value. It's a commodity. And when you lend it to someone and they use that money, you are entitled to interest in return. I would also say, I'm not hesitant to say the parts of the Torah that are difficult for me, that offend me, and that are impossible for me to believe that this is God's voice. And one of them is this idea that you can charge interest to non-Jews, but you can't charge interest to Jews. It is produced anti-Semitism. It produced Shylock, the Merchant of Venice. It produced an entire medieval tradition and a connection between Jews and money. It's very destructive. And this parsha also has the law of the Eved Olam, that if you're a slave, you get to go free eventually. There's a manumission of death and slaves. But if you want to stay a slave, you can stay a slave, and your owner can pierce your ear, and you're then his slave forever. I don't think a person should ever be allowed to be a slave. No one should be allowed to own another person. And the Torah's idea that some people are happier being slaves, and it's their will that they be slaves, is only an example of people who don't have the will to freedom yet. There were blacks who were emancipated, who didn't want to leave the plantations because they had a culture there, and that is not the way people should live. And they needed, those who wanted to be free were the vast majority, but those who wanted to remain slaves were passed over and criticized, and I think rightly so, because it is not human destiny to be a slave. And the Torah's attitude toward slavery, the Torah's attitude toward interest, reflect an ancient world. But I choose, as you do, to focus on the leket and the harvesting of the corners of the field as an example of how the Torah can still speak to the modern world. And I think the part of it that I would add finally that is the most constructive in this parsha is don't harden your heart. Don't harden your heart, using the same phrase that was used to describe what happened to the Pharaoh. That it's, to me, the most perfect phrase to describe insensitivity to the poor. Michael Harrington spoke about how when the Cross Bronx Expressway was built, charitable donations went down because people could drive through the poor areas of the Bronx and not have to see poor people. And so they didn't, their heart wasn't changed and softened because of the vision of poor people around them. I give to every beggar I see, just because I don't want to harden my heart. So I think the final word is that the Torah has some very positive elements of how we have to modify our material acquisitiveness, but it also is blind in certain very, very important and embarrassing areas.
Absolutely. Thank you. I want to just extend that point that you made, Michael Harrington's observation on that point, because I think there is something very important here that's being communicated in this particular section of Torah and in the whole section we've read today in Deuteronomy 14 and Deuteronomy 15, which is the Torah's interest here isn't just to create a society in which the poor are provided for. The Torah's interest isn't just to create a society in which the poor are, where systemic poverty doesn't take root. The Torah is trying as well to change the way that people think about the money that they acquire, the way that the economic player thinks about themselves. It's a change the economic rationality of the populace. And I think this is very, very clear. You're exactly right. In the reference over and over again to remember you were a slave in Egypt means you carry a sense of where you are in the world and how you feel about all this stuff because you carry it from your own experiences. I'll just share one brief story about my own experience with this. In my own experience, many years ago, I took my wife on a cruise to Tahiti. It was our 25th wedding anniversary. And we took this beautiful place. I mean, it's really everything you've read about it. It's a paradise. So one of these, we were on numbers of islands in the Tahitian islands. There's many of them. And we're on one particular island, and we had booked a Jeep tour. And the Jeep tour was being offered by this very large fellow who was a native of the island, but who had gone off to Cambridge and studied. So the guy spoke with a beautiful British accent and knew everything about Western culture, but was, this very large Polynesian fellow wearing nothing but a sort of a pareo, which is just sort of a little skirt and some sandals, and that's it, and lovely guy. I mean, so first of all, the contrast between the way he was dressed and then, the fact that he speaks with this Cambridge accent was just beautiful. So at one point, he takes us through this valley in this island, and he says, okay, everybody off the truck. And all of us scramble off the truck. And he says, I want you to look around. What do you see? He says, if you were hungry, what could you eat? And people start pointing out, oh, there's a coconut tree. There's a pineapple tree. There's breadfruit. There's grapefruit. There's passion fruit. There's papaya. There's mango. He says, that's exactly right. There's fish in the streams. There's fruit on the trees. You couldn't starve on this island if you tried. He said, that's the difference between you and us, right? You Westerners are raised on an ethic of scarcity. You're worried that there isn't enough. And because there isn't enough, you have to hold on to what you have and jealously guard it. We Polynesians, we know there's always enough. And if there's always enough, we don't have to be so possessive about the things we hold on to. If you notice in Polynesia, he told us, homes don't have front doors. They put a shmata in front of the door to keep animals in and out, but they don't have front doors. And if you walk up to a Polynesian home as a stranger, they are obligated by tradition to invite you in and feed you. No matter how poor they are, they will give you the best of what they have. And the reason is because there is an ethic of abundance, an ethic of plenty. And there's no worry that if I give it to a guest, I'm not going to have enough for me and my own. There's always more. There's always plenty. I mean, one of the things, Margaret Mead wrote this very interesting and controversial book about the coming of age in Samoa, where she talked about this sort of loosening of sexual mores. And he said, we're not sure that's exactly true, but even if it was, he said, the reason is because if someone has a child, there's plenty of family to raise that kid, and there's plenty to go around. We're not worried about someone having an extra child that will go wanting. So what the Torah tells me the same thing is one of the reasons why, besides dealing with the problem of poverty, that you're only allowed to go over your field or your vineyard or orchard once. It's not just to solve the problem of poverty, but to teach you that that's enough. Once is enough. Dayenu. The word dayenu means I have enough. Once is enough. You don't have to be so jealous, so possessive, so grasping. God will provide. There's plenty for you. And the people that I have known in my life who live by that ethic are much more pleasant to be around than the people I know in my life who are otherwise. So let's finish our conversation today. We've talked about capitalism, we've talked about market economies, we've talked about our obligation to protect the poor, and the wonderful sense of sacred economics, that economics have a deep, important place in a sacred life, because as the Apter Rav said, you can't just be Shomer Shabbos, you have to be Shomer Chol. You have to bring your ethics into the real world. So tonight is Simchas Torah, tomorrow is Simchas Torah. We're going to finish the Torah. We're going to roll it back to the beginning. We're going to start all over again. So here's a hard question for you, Rabbi Gellman. Of all the Torah, 5,480 verses of Torah. What's the one verse that every Jew has to know by heart? What's the one verse that we have to hold? You know, as the Torah says, put it on your arm and put it between your eyes. What's the one verse that every Jew has to hold on to? What do you think?
Well, it's clearly the Shema. I mean, because without it, all the other laws make no sense. The idea that we have dignity and holiness makes no sense unless there's a dignifier and a holiness creator. We have no rights, but our sanctity comes from something that a state cannot take away. So the idea that there is a single God, and that God is the one we worship, means that there is a source for human dignity beyond the state. Secondly, the single God means that you can engage in science. You know, the Nobel laureates were announced this week, and I was looking, are they Jewish? Is this a Jewish name? Is that a Jewish name? And, you know, I had so much pride because so many of the Nobel laureates have been Jews. And the idea of why there's so many Jewish scientists and exceptional scientists is from the Shema. Because if you believe there's many gods, what do you need to figure anything out? There's just another God for that and another God for that. But if there's a single God, then there is ultimately, and this was what Feinstein was working on his whole life and never truly discovered, that there was a single principle, a single animating principle of the entire universe. And that's what science endeavors to discover. So a single God means science is possible, means philosophy is possible. There's truth. It means it isn't just your opinion and that opinion, this God and that God. It means there is a single God who is responsible for everything. And so, although the Shema is my easy choice, my personal choice is Isaiah, Yotzer Or V'Orei Choshech, Oseh Shalom V'Orei Ra. Isaiah teaches, I am God who creates light, Yotzer Or V'Orei Choshech, makes darkness, Oseh Shalom makes peace, V'Orei Ra, and who creates evil. It means this is not some fuzzy pale God that I worship. This is a God responsible for a world with incredible suffering. And I believe God suffers with us and through that. But this God is the source of everything, the source of everything. And that verse reminds me whenever I come to it.
Thank you. That's beautiful. That was wonderful. And I'll ask everyone at home too. We're rolling the Torah through from Deuteronomy back to Breshit. What's the one verse that really moves all of you? And the one verse you would want your loved ones, your friends, the people of the world to really remember and to know.
Hey, you.
I'm going to give you mine. I'm going to give you mine. Before I give you mine, though, I want you to. You mentioned the Nobel Prizes. So yeah. I have a brother who's a very talented economist. So he calculated how many Jewish Nobel Prizes there were so far. And this is what he sent me. He sent this to me late last night. He said, the literature prize went to a woman who's Jewish.
Right.
One quarter of the physics prize went to a woman who's half Jewish, and 1/3 of the medicine prize went to a Jew. And if you add them up, 1 plus 1/3 it ends up with 1 and 11/24 went to Jews this time. So we'll see what else is coming. We still have a few more to come. I really love what you said. And this is, I'm thinking that, this is going to indicate the difference between you and me and how much we love each other, but how much we see the world through very different eyes. I would have to say, Genesis 12, God says to Abraham, Lech lecha me'artzecha, I want you to leave what you're familiar with. I want you to leave the culture that has shaped you. I want you to leave the family that you're attached to. I want you to follow me into the world. And it says, I'll make of you a great nation. I'll make your name great. V'heyeh bracha. To me, Hayeh bracha, that's the most important verse, because that's my human obligation. Now they go together very nicely, yours and mine. But the obligation that must be in front of my eyes at every moment of life is: are you being a blessing? Can you be a blessing? Is there any way at this moment, in this circumstance, under these conditions, that you can be a blessing? Because that's the measure of whether a life matters or not. No one cares how much money you made after you're gone. No one cares how much power you wielded after you're gone. The only thing they want to know is, did you add blessing to the world? Were you a blessing? And that, to me, is the way that a Jew, or any person, earns immortality in the world. It's the measure of a successful life, and it's the ethical principle that you keep in front of you at every moment of the day, so that you have a sense of where I am in the world ethically. I'll ask everyone at home, what's your favorite, what verse, what's the verse that you want to hold on to? And if you have a moment, you can send it to me on an email, and I'll gather them and announce them next week. Rabbi Marc Gellman, Hag Sameach, good Shabbos, be gesund. I'll see you next week. Take good care. Rabbi Sherry Hirsch, have a quiet day, have a quiet rest. And to everyone, a very sweet and happy holiday. Following our Torah study, of course, Yontif services, Shabbos and Chag, and the recitation of Yisker. All that begins at 10 o'clock this morning. Tonight, Simchas Torah at 7 o'clock tonight, right here on Zoom or on Facebook and YouTube. Tomorrow morning, Yontif services at 10 o'clock in the morning, celebrating the beginning of the new cycle of the Torah. We're going to honor some dear friends. Jerry and Lola Rabo have accepted the honor of Chatan Torah. They're wonderful people, have contributed so much of themselves to our community. And Steve and Debbie Perlman will honor us with Chatan Breshit, or Kala Breshit. Steve was the director of our high holiday services, and he and Debbie have given so much of their hearts. So we honor them tomorrow morning at VBS or whatever synagogue you're in. Tune into Simchas Torah and enjoy the fact that we have been given this beautiful gift of Torah. Shabbat Shalom, Hag Sameach.
Shabbat Shalom, my friend.